Hello YouTube and welcome back to another alternate history video, and today I got the 1988 presidential election, which of course was held between the Vice President George H.W. Bush and Democrat Michael Dukakis from Massachusetts. And 1988 coming off 2 terms of Ronald Reagan, and Bush was basically running to be Reagan's 3rd term, and he was able to win against Dukakis, and Dukakis was pretty ineffective in the debates. Of course, Bush attacked him great, and Dukakis didn't really have a good comeback, so that was able to propel Bush in the debate and ultimately to victory, and it's still pretty good landslide. Dukakis did do better, and of course Mondale and Carter has a little party fatigue having to play up 2 terms of Reagan, but Reagan was still popular enough that could propel Bush to a victory, and like I said, Dukakis being pretty weak in the debates and not being able to counter Bush's attacks, and Dukakis was seen as too liberal and elite. And like I said, Bush was able to get that victory. But in this alternate scenario, I do got Joe Biden, who was a senator at the time from Delaware. I got him as a nominee, and he did run in 1988, but dropped out because of plagiarism accusations that he plagiarized a speech. And so he dropped out because of that and didn't gain any momentum. However, in this alternate scenario, I do got him as a nominee if maybe that didn't happen, or the field didn't really have that strong of candidates and he was able to get through and win the nomination. So like I said, maybe that plagiarism accusation doesn't happen and he's able to get good momentum and present himself as the moderate who could possibly beat Bush and win Democrats back the White House. So like I said, I got Biden as a Democratic nominee in this scenario. Now, 1988, like I said, there was still economic prosperity, and Reagan was still relatively popular, and of course it was term limited. But there was a few scandals in his administration, like Iran-Contra affair, and there was also a farming crisis too, which definitely hurt farmers in the state of Iowa, and Dukakis was able to win that state because of it. So things like that did kind of hurt the Republicans a little bit, but obviously it wasn't enough for a Democratic victory, because Reagan, like I said, still had relatively popular approval ratings and stuff, so Bush was able to capitalize on that, and like I said, Dukakis being pretty ineffective in the debates. But anyway, I could see this being pretty similar, even with Biden as a nominee, and like I say, he definitely had that moderate stature back then, so that could help him do pretty well in the same areas that Dukakis did. And starting out, I believe Bush is going to definitely take these Great Plains states, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and his home state of Texas. Definitely win these solidly Republican strongholds. And still are today. Of course, Texas got a little more competitive, but these states through here, definitely Great Plains, are definitely going to go for Bush, as well as these Mountain West states of like Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah. A lot of Mormon population in these states. But definitely go for Bush. Alaska, and I think Arizona was a pretty solid margin back then. I'm actually going to check that. And yes, it was. Of course, Dukakis did pretty well over here, but other than that, it was still a solid win for Bush, so I believe it would be against Biden as well. Dukakis actually won Washington and Oregon after they went for Reagan, because Reagan had his West Coast appeal being from California, and the states were more Republican-leaning, although Washington sometimes went for Democrats in some elections, but they were more Republican back then. However, around this time, the urban and suburban areas in the states were shifting Democratic, and ever since then, these states haven't won Democrat because of that suburban and urban shift to the left. And that's why Dukakis was able to win these states. But they were still relatively close, though. As you see there, only by a margin of 1%. But because of that urban-suburban shift, like I mentioned, I could still see Biden actually winning it. But still very narrowly, like Dukakis did. So I'll do that in a tilt margin. And I believe Oregon was pretty tilt, too. And you see there it was. Well, actually, it was a little bigger than Washington, actually 51 to 46. So about a few points there. And I think Biden would win it since Dukakis did. Maybe in a lean margin, like it was with Dukakis. Well, that was at least by 4 or 5 points, so I think Biden would do the same. California, however, I believe went to Bush by a couple points. This was the last time California went Republican. After this, it went Democratic and has gone since then. However, this was the last time, like I said, California went Republican. It was only by a margin of 3%, though, so I think I would say that way, and Bush would take it in a lean margin. Of course, California really shifted because of demographics and educational trends after Reagan passed mass amnesty in 1986. And like I said, the educational trends mixing with that definitely turned the state blue, in my opinion. But I think Bush would hang on to it since he did win it against Dukakis. I think Hawaii here is going to be solid for Biden. Nevada, I believe, was another solid state for Bush. Margin of 20%, so definitely a safe state for George, so I believe it would stay that way against Biden. And Colorado and New Mexico also went for Bush. There's like margins. It was pretty solid there, as you see. 53-45. So I think it would stay that way. It was a likely margin. So I believe that would stay that way for Bush. And New Mexico as well, like I said, went for him. A few points there. 51-45. At least by 4 or 5 points. So I think I would stay that way with Bush. Pretty likely there. Minnesota up here did go for Dukakis, of course, has gone Democratic since 1976. And I think I would stay that way with Bush here since Dukakis won by a likely margin. Or excuse me, Biden. He'll stick with him in a likely margin since Dukakis won it that way. Like I said, Iowa here did actually go for Dukakis. I'll come back to that because, like I said, there was a farming crisis. But other states here, like Missouri, was a Bush state, of course, very rural. And it was a bellwether back then. Usually went for the winner, I believe. It's considered a swing state. And it went there by a few points, so I think I would say that way for George Bush in a lean margin. Illinois, he did win. Of course, Republicans did better in the suburbs back then and decent in the rural areas. Well, Dukakis actually did pretty good in the rural areas there, as you see, but definitely Chicago and the suburbs, Republicans did better in, and Bush was able to win it. It was by a couple points, though, so I think I would say that way in a tilt margin. Wisconsin, I believe, was won by Dukakis. And sure enough, it was. A few points I see there. He did good here in this western part. Bush did better in the eastern part. And it was a state won by Reagan. However, as you see there, like I said, it was won by Bush. Bush did good, like in the Wow counties, as you see there. While Dukakis did better, like in these parts, like I said, where like Milwaukee and places like that are. So since it was actually won by Dukakis, I think Biden could still win it. But I think it could narrow up some, so I'm going to put it as a lean. However, I think Michigan will go for Bush because I believe he won in a likely margin. As you see there, he did. So I think they would stick with him because they still liked Reagan's policies, economic policies. So I believe Bush would win that. I believe he'd take Indiana solid here, as well as a state like Florida. I believe that wasn't even contested. Most of the South here, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas. These states definitely solid. Went for Bush and Reagan as well. They really loved his economic and social conservatism that he pushed. Of course, the moral majority was a big force in the 80s, so I think Bush would win these with ease, as well as Georgia. I think that was pretty safe or likely. As you see, there is definitely at least a 1 point margin. So I think I would say that way for Bush, as well as Tennessee and Kentucky. Like I said, these Appalachian and rural states here in the South definitely love Reagan's economic and policies and social conservatism that he pushed. Virginia here, the same, I think would be likely to safe for Bush, as it was a Republican state and went that way since 1952, with the exception of 64. So I think they would definitely save with Bush, and it was actually a safe margin, so I'll change it to that. North Carolina and South Carolina, like I said, the South, all these states definitely liked Reagan's policy, so I think they would stick with Bush. Iowa, I'm going to go back to that. Like I said, it was actually won by Dukakis. They actually didn't really expect him to win it. It was kind of an upset. I think it was a relatively likely margin that he won it by. It was actually a 10-point margin. And I think Biden would actually do the same, because like I said, there was a farming crisis during the Reagan administration. That definitely hurt the farmers in the state, so I think Biden would take this in a likely margin. West Virginia did go for Dukakis, as it was more of a Democratic state back then. Oop, clicked on Ohio. West Virginia is what I'm trying to get to. So yeah, like I said, it went for Dukakis by at least 5 points or so. So I think I would stick with Biden and probably a lean margin. Like I said, it was definitely more Democratic, and Democrats did better with the coal mining industry back then. So I think they would stick with Biden. Ohio did go for Bush. And you see there he won it by at least 11 points. So I think I would stick with him. Like I said, they loved Reagan's policies, so Bush would win that, I believe. I think it would take these states up here, like all of Maine. These were more Republican states. And same with Vermont. I think that was pretty likely. I could see it narrowing up, though, because of Biden's New England appeal here, being from Delaware. But I think it would still be pretty likely for Bush, because Vermont very rural and more Republican back then. Of course, they didn't go Democrat until 92, and it's gone that way since. But I think Bush would hang on to it, as well as New Hampshire would be pretty likely, as these were more Republican states, like I said. New York, though, I believe, went for Dukakis, but I think it was only by a lean margin or so. Of course, he did go to New York City, while Bush did go to upstate. So I think Biden would do the same, because of New York City, like I said, and a lean margin or so. Pennsylvania actually was won by Bush, because he did pretty good in the suburbs as a state. However, I could see Biden winning it, because they would have that, like I said, home state factory was born here, known as Scranton Joe. So I think it would actually take it. But I think it'd be pretty narrow, though, probably in a tilt margin, because I think Bush won it pretty solidly, but because of that home state factor for Biden, I think it would actually take this in a tilt margin. But I could see it going either way, really. Massachusetts, I believe, would be pretty safe for him, to likely. Bush was pretty competitive in it, because Bush was actually born in Massachusetts, I believe. But it was also Dukakis' home state. And I say there was a likely margin, so I think it would be for Biden, too. Same with Rhode Island, I believe that was one by Dukakis. And it was pretty safe, so I think it would be that way for Biden, too. As well as his home state of Delaware. Although I think Connecticut would go for Bush, as that was more Republican, as well as New Jersey. That'd be pretty likely. Biden would be pretty competitive in it, being from neighboring Delaware, but I think it would still be likely for Bush, since it was more of a Republican state back then. Maryland, I believe, I think I went for Dukakis. Let me check. No, it actually went for Bush by a few points, so maybe I could still see it going for Bush since it did against Dukakis, but I think it would be narrow because of Biden being from neighboring Delaware. However, DC would go for him for sure. So there's the final map. Bush still wins 398 to Joe Biden's 139. Thank you for watching. Subscribe and hit the bell for notifications if you haven't. And I'll see you next time.